Picture this in your mind for a second. It is the morning of August 6th, 1945. You are a 6-year-old boy and you're just walking to school.
Right, just a totally normal routine.
Exactly. The air raid sirens, which usually blare day and night, completely shredding your nerves, they are actually quiet for once.
Which is probably incredibly rare.
Yeah, super rare. The sky above you is this pristine, crystalline blue. It feels like a precious moment of peace, almost like a normal summer morning. And then there's a flash, a completely silent, blinding flash of light that just instantly changes human history forever.
Yeah, it really is the exact moment the world fractured.
It is. And today's deep dive is about what happens in the seconds, the days, and the decades after that flash. We are looking at a profound exploration of human resilience, the absolute unfiltered realities of war, and the aftermath of the atomic bomb.
And this is all centered around the semi-autobiographical manga and the 1983 anime film Barefoot Gen, or Hadashi no Gen in Japan.
Right, because this is the dividing line, between everything that came before and the entirely new, terrifying atomic reality that came after.
Yeah, and what makes exploring this specific narrative so vital is that this isn't just some secondary historical summary. It's not a textbook.
No, not at all.
This is a primary historical document that has been translated into art. It's the story of surviving the unimaginable, told from the perspective of someone who was actually standing right there under that pristine blue sky when it happened.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can truly understand the art itself, we really have to understand the artist.
And the dual realities of the world he was thrust into, right?
Exactly. So the creator of Barefoot Gen is Keiji Nakazawa, born in 1939, and he was exactly 6 years old when the bomb was dropped on his hometown of Hiroshima.
Just a little kid.
Yeah. The trajectory of his entire life was indelibly shaped by that single blinding flash. I mean, he went from being a child survivor wandering the radioactive ashes of his city to eventually moving to Tokyo in 1961 to become a monk.
And initially he was just drawing, standard anthologies, right?
Yeah, just normal stuff. But after his mother's death in 1966, the dam just broke for him. He felt this immense, undeniable compulsion to share what he actually saw on that day.
He really dedicated his entire life and his life's work to nuclear disarmament right up until his death from lung cancer in 2012.
And to fully grasp the weight of his work, we have to kind of situate his personal experience within the broader geopolitical context of the time.
A context that he was, of course, entirely unaware of as a 6-year-old boy.
Oh, completely. He had no idea. But on one side of the globe, you had the United States and the Manhattan Project.
Right, which was an enterprise of just unprecedented scale and secrecy.
It was massive, and it was driven by this really fascinating friction between its leaders. You had Major General Leslie Groves, who basically viewed this entirely as a massive military logistics operation.
And then you had the theoretical physicist, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was managing all the unprecedented scientific hurdles.
Exactly. Their mandate was to weaponize the atom, which obviously culminated in the Trinity test on July 16, 1945, out in the New Mexico.
I always find that bureaucratic friction so fascinating. You have the military mind colliding with the scientific mind.
Yeah, both just racing toward the same devastating conclusion. And the rationale for deploying that weapon, at least as laid out in the historical records of the time, was based on a very specific military calculus.
Right, the strategic projections.
Yeah, so President Truman and the American military planners, they looked at the sheer ferocity of They projected that the Japanese military would basically fight to the bitter end if an Allied main attack occurred.
So the justification presented was that dropping these newly birthed weapons would force an immediate surrender.
Right. First, the 4,400 kilogram uranium-235 gun-type bomb known as Little Boy on Hiroshima, and then later the plutonium implosion bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki.
And the administration's argument was that this would hypothetically save the lives of an estimated 250,000 Allied troops and an equal number of Japanese citizens by avoiding a prolonged ground war.
Exactly. And they also frequently cited the attack on Pearl Harbor as part of the moral justification for bombings.
But that is the macro view. That's the arithmetic performed in war rooms thousands of miles away.
Right. It's very detached.
It is. But the reality on the ground in Japan, the micro view where Nakazawa's story actually began, that was operating on an entirely different frequency.
Oh, completely different. The Japanese military and government were leaning so heavily on the unwavering, basically mandated patriotism of their...
They were preparing a total unified front. I mean, the reality for ordinary citizens is incredibly grim at that point.
Yeah, the state was actively conditioning women, children, and the elderly to fight off highly trained, fully armed invading force. And they were told to do this with nothing but sharpened bamboo spears.
Which is just a completely absurd, desperate strategy when you really think.
I mean, bamboo spears against mechanized infantry, it's unimaginable.
It really speaks to the level of state control and just utter desperation. Meanwhile, The actual day-to-day existence of families, like the Nakaoka family depicted in Barefoot Gen, was defined by extreme poverty and near starvation.
Yeah, the wartime rationing was so severe that just basic survival was this daily, agonizing puzzle.
And the narrative tension that creates in the story is almost unbearable.
It really is. It's like living under the ultimate sword of Damocles, because you have these saccharine, overly cheerful moments depicted in the early parts of the story that feel entirely surreal.
Oh, like the koi fish scene.
Yes, exactly. There's the sequence where Gen and his younger brother Shinji are desperately trying to find food for their pregnant, severely malnourished mother, Kimi.
Right, and she's just incredibly weak.
So they go so far as to steal a highly prized koi carp from a wealthy neighbor's pond.
And the neighbor actually catches them, physically beats Gen, but then he sort of recognizes the sheer desperation of their poverty.
Right. He ultimately gives them the fish out of, and the boys run home completely thrilled. They are laughing. The music swells with this cheery optimism, and they feed this fish to their mother, who is weeping with gratitude.
It is this incredibly innocent, mundane struggle for survival.
But as a viewer or a reader, your stomach is just in knot, because you know exactly what is hovering over them. You know the date, you know the time, you know the altitude of the bomber.
Yeah, the dramatic irony is overwhelming.
The cheerful, mundane moments stand in such stark, terrifying contrast to the impending, mechanized doom that you just know is hurtling toward them.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that emotional dissonance is precisely the point.
How so?
Well, Nakazawa intentionally portrayed this hyper-innocent, desperately mundane poverty to strip away the grand geopolitical narrative. He wanted to show that the people on the ground in Hiroshima weren't military strategists or zealots. They were just sandal makers, mothers, and children playing in the dirt.
Right, they were just ordinary people.
Exactly. They were caught inside the gears of a massive machine, a war fueled by nationalistic pride and the military elite on one side, and unprecedented scientific weaponry on the other. And they had absolutely zero control over any of it.
They were just trying to survive until dinner, completely unaware that a 4,400-kilogram device of unimaginable destruction was already loaded onto a B-29 bomber aimed squarely at their specific geographic coordinates.
So the question becomes, how do you take an experience like that, an event that just defies all human comprehension, and translate it into a digestible narrative?
Right. How do you put the apocalypse onto a page or onto a screen without losing the humanity of it?
And that leads us directly into the really fascinating friction between the original manga that Nakazawa wrote and the highly condensed 1983 anime adaptation produced by Studio Madhouse.
Because translating profound trauma into art is always a volatile process, right?
Absolutely. At the very core of Nakazawa's narrative in the manga is a specific biological metaphor. It's established early on by Gen's father, Daikichi.
Oh, the metaphor of the wheat.
Yes, exactly. The wheat.
It's such a powerful image. Daikichi literally takes his young sons out to a barren field in the dead of winter just to look at the wheat. He explains the life cycle of this grain.
Right, how the wheat has to endure the bitter, freezing temperatures.
Yeah, and worse than that, as it starts to sprout, it gets trampled into the dirt by people walking all over.
But Daikichi explains that this trampling is actually necessary, doesn't it?
He says it forces the roots to grip the earth harder. Despite all that extreme hardship, it takes root, grows strong, and eventually it yields a rich, staining harvest.
And he tells Gen and Shinji that they must be exactly like that wheat. No matter how many times the world stomps them into the freezing ground, they have to stubbornly keep growing.
It's a philosophy of absolute resilience. And while the anime adaptation touches on this wheat metaphor briefly at the beginning and the end of the film, it really leaves out a massive amount of the context that originally gave that metaphor.
Oh, definitely. Because the manga is this sprawling, incredibly dense 10-volume epic.
Yeah, it's huge.
The 1983 anime condenses this drastically. It basically rips out the heart of the first 2 or 3 volumes and squeezes them into a single movie.
And in doing so, it kind of smooths out the deeply uncomfortable, highly critical societal observations that Nakazawa included.
You really notice that when comparing the two. In the anime, the Nakaoka family is depicted primarily as just victims of a starving wartime economy.
Right. They are hungry, and it's sad. But in the manga, their living condition is an active waking nightmare, and it's not just because of the food shortages.
No, it's because the father, Daikichi, is openly and aggressively anti-war.
He is. He absolutely refuses to toe the patriotic line mandated by the state. He vocalizes his belief that the war is a massive mistake and that the military leaders are marching the country into a meat grinder.
And the consequences for that kind of vocal dissent in wartime Japan were severe.
Very severe.
It was enforced largely by the Tonorigumi, or the neighborhood associations. These were essentially citizen networks mandated by the government to enforce ideological conformity, ration distribution, and air raid drills.
So if you spoke against the war, the Tonarigumi would ensure that...
Exactly. The manga shows the Nakaoka family being violently persecuted by their own community. Daikichi is officially branded a traitor.
The local neighborhood chairman constantly harasses them, basically denying them their ration. And this state-sanctioned hatred bleeds down directly to the children.
Right, the bullying is relentless.
It's awful. Gen and his siblings are bullied so terribly by the other kids that they actually have to resort to biting people's fingers off just to defend themselves.
And the town's collective hatred reaches this horrific peak when the eldest daughter, Aiko, falsely accused of being a thief.
Yeah, she is subjected to a deeply humiliating strip search at her school, purely as retribution for her father's policy.
But the thing is, none of that systemic societal bullying makes it into the anime.
No, the anime has one very brief, almost sanitized, where Daikichi expresses and Gen tells him to voice down, but the vicious reprisal higher.
And it's not just the socio-political cruelty that gets cut. Entire members of the family just vanish.
It's wild. The manga explicitly features 4 sons and a daughter, but the movie only shows Gen, his younger brother Shinji, and the older sister Aiko.
They completely remove the eldest son, Koji.
Right, the one who actually joins the military, against his parents' desperate wish because he thinks it's the only way to restore honor to the family name and stop the town from starving.
And they remove another brother, Kira, who was part of the mass evacuation of children to the country.
The omission of Koji and Akira really changes the narrative structure significantly. It removes the complex internal friction of a family being torn apart by differing ideological approach to survival in a fashion.
The anime also removes a deeply poignant detail regarding American POW.
Yes. In the manga, Gen and Shinji noticed that American prisoners of war would paint a large letter P on the roofs of the building were held.
And they figured out why.
They observed that the American bombers would recognize the P and spare those specific buildings during air raids.
Wow.
So, operating purely on childhood logic, the 2 little boys climb up a giant P on the roof of their own home, genuinely believing it will protect their family from the American bombers.
It's such a brilliant, heartbreaking detail. It perfectly captures how children try to navigate the massive, incomprehensible theater of war using whatever small rules they can observe.
So looking at all these structural omissions, it really makes you wonder. By removing the violent societal bullying, by erasing the internal family conflicts of Kira, and by cutting these specific survival details like P, does the anime inadvertently water down Nakazawa's core message?
That's a great question.
Does it let the Japanese wartime society off the hook? Or does it simply sharpen the narrative focus entirely onto the bomb itself?
Well, that is the central debate regarding the adaptation. By stripping away the socio-political context of the town's persecution, the anime undeniably isolates the family. It turns them into pure victims of circumstance, completely innocent bystanders.
Which changes the feel completely.
It does. From a cinematic perspective, one could argue this makes the impending drop of the atomic bomb feel even more universally tragic because the narrative isn't bogged down in local politics.
Right. It makes it more of a universal human tragedy.
Exactly. However, the streamlining creates a severe structural issue with the film's tone. The anime struggles with massive, almost disorienting tonal whiplash.
Oh, the whiplash is intense. I describe it almost like watching a classic bouncy cartoon suddenly crossfade into a brutal, unflinching combat documentary.
Yes, that's a perfect way to describe it.
You have Gen and Shinji drawn in this very childlike, exaggerated, almost chibi style. They have disproportionate limbs. They engage in slapstick comedy. They have these massive expressive faces.
And then, literally a moment later, the film shifts without warning into hyper-realistic, grotesque bodily horror.
It leaves the viewer constantly off balance. You find yourself wondering, is this an educational movie meant for children to learn about history? Or is it an R-rated adult film that just happens to feature child protagonists?
It really creates a deeply dissonant viewing experience. But, if we analyze the psychology behind it, that dissonance is exactly what Nakazawa experienced.
That's very true.
He didn't live a smooth, well-paced narrative. He experienced the most jarring shift in human history, going from catching fish and playing in the dirt with his brother straight into the literal apocalypse in a fraction of a second.
So the animation style forces the viewer to feel that exact psychological shock, the violent collision of childhood innocence with industrial-scale slaughter.
Exactly.
And here's where it gets really interesting from a cinematic and historical perspective. That collision happens on August 6, 1945, at exactly 8:04 a.m.
The exact moment of the drop.
Yes. The depiction of the bombing by Studio Madhouse is universally regarded as one of the most masterful and deeply disturbing sequences ever put to film.
It is unforgettable. The
B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, drops the little boy bomb, and it falls for exactly 43 seconds. And the way the film captures the exact microsecond of detonation is phenomenal.
The visual shift is incredible.
The entire color palette of the film instantly shifts. It abandons all natural colors for these terrifying, unnatural, sickly hue. Deep purples, stark blood reds, and blinding, washed-out whites.
The shift in color palette visually communicates that the natural world has just been overwritten by something entirely alien.
Right.
But before the blast even hits the ground, there's a specific auditory choice that is incredibly powerful. The use of complete, trackless silence.
Oh, the silence is deafening.
Literally. Before the roar of the explosion reaches the characters, the film employs an agonizing, dead silent freeze frame. It's a literal suspension of time.
The characters are frozen mid-step, mid-sentence.
It emphasizes, with terrifying clarity, how normal life in Hiroshima just stops in an instant. It is the deathly calm before the blast wave hits.
And when that silence breaks, the physical reality that follows is unflinching. We need to talk about the mechanisms of what the animation actually shows, because it is based directly on Nakazawa's first-hand memory.
And it's almost impossible to stomach.
It really is. The film doesn't just show a big explosion. It shows the physiological reality of a nuclear detonation on the human body.
The immediate effects of the thermal flash.
Right, which reach temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. People caught in that flash are shown literally melting alive. You see flesh instantaneously liquefying and dissolving off the bone.
It's horrific.
You see people's eyeballs popping and falling out of their skulls, which is terribly a scientifically accurate result of the sudden extreme drop in atmospheric pressure caused by the shockwave.
The physics of the blast just turned the city into a literal hellscape. The thermal radiation ignited everything combustible within miles, followed immediately by a supersonic blast wave that leveled the city's infrastructure.
And those who weren't instantly vaporized or crushed are depicted wandering through the fiery ruins.
Their skin, severely burned by the flash, is shown sleuthing off and hanging from their arms and faces like ragged strips of cloth.
Nakazawa referred to them in his accounts as looking like ghosts or monsters.
Right, walking with their arms outstretched to keep their raw, exposed nerves from rubbing against their side, begging for water in a landscape that had been completely incinerated.
And Gen survives this initial vaporizing flash solely because of a microscopic coincidence. He just happened to bend down to pick up a rock from behind a sturdy stone wall at the exact millisecond the bomb detonated.
The wall took the brunt of the thermal flash.
Exactly. So when he regains his senses and digs himself out of the rubble, his immediate instinct is to run. And this is where the sheer scale of the city's destruction is suddenly eclipsed by localized, deeply personal tragedy.
He navigates the burning ruins and finds his house completely collapsed.
Yeah. Trapped underneath the incredibly heavy, traditional wooden support beams of the roof are his father, Daikichi, his older sister, Aiko, and his little brother, Shin.
And his mother, Kimi, who is heavily pregnant. She survived only because she was standing slightly outside the main collapse zone.
So when Gen arrives, she is frantically, hysterically pulling at the massive wooden beams, just trying to lift the crushing weight off her family.
And Gen joins her, but the physical reality is just insurmountable.
It's impossible. They are just a 6-year-old child and a pregnant woman. They are completely powerless against the sheer tonnage of the debris.
And the fire is spreading fast.
Yeah, the thermal heat of the bomb ignited hundreds of secondary fires that began merging into a massive firestorm. The absolute agony of this scene is hard to overcome.
Gen and his mother are forced to stand there and listen to Daikichi, Aiko, and little Shinji screaming for help as the flames begin to engulf the wreckage.
Shinji is crying out that it's hot, that he's terrified, and Daikichi, realizing the absolute finality of this situation, he stops asking for help.
In his final moments, he orders Gen to take his mother and run away. He commands his surviving son to live.
So Gen actually has to physically drag his screaming, fighting mother away from the house, forcing them to flee and basically leave their family to burn to death alive before their eyes.
It is an incomprehensible level of trauma. To lose your family in such a violent, immediate manner, to hear their voices as they die, while being entirely physically powerless to stop it.
It's gut-wrenching.
It really is. And then the narrative introduces a moment of profound, almost cruel irony. Immediately following the blast, while they are surrounded by the burning rubble of their city and the literal ashes of their family, the extreme physiological shock and psychological stress caused Gen's mother to go into premature labor.
Right there, on the side of the road, amidst the apocalypse, surrounded by corpses, she gives birth to a baby girl, who they name Tomoko.
It is the ultimate literal manifestation of the wheat metaphor Daikichi spoke of.
Wow, yeah, you're right.
In the absolute most hellish, burning, toxic winter imaginable, new life stubbornly, biologically sprouts from the ashes. It's a testament to the raw biological imperative to continue, even when the world as you know it has completely.
You would naturally assume that surviving the immediate explosion, escaping the firestorm, and successfully delivering a baby would be the climax story. You survived the atomic, you made it.
But as the historical reality revealed, for Gen, and for the hundreds of thousands of real-life survivors, the true nightmare was actually just beginning.
Because the initial blast was only the first phase of the weapon. This brings us to the aftermath and the invisible enemy.
The lingering ghost of the bomb. The immediate environment of Hiroshima was irreparably altered. The massive firestorm created powerful updrafts that sucked the radioactive debris, pulverized building materials, and carbonized remains high into the atmosphere.
And this material mixed with the moisture in the air, condensed, and fell back to the Earth as a phenomenon known as the Black Rain.
Which was thick, oily, highly radioactive precipitation.
And the survivors, who were desperately dehydrated from the intense heat of the flash and the roaring fires, they didn't understand what it was.
How could?
Right, so they opened their mouths to catch this rain, or they eagerly drank from the rivers that were choked with corpses and contaminated runoff. They were completely unaware that they were internally poisoning themselves with massive doses of ionizing radiation.
And within days, people who seemed to have survived without a scratch began dropping dead mysteriously.
The survivors called it Genbaku Burabura, which translates roughly to atomic bomb lethargy disease.
The mechanics of radiation sickness are just horrifying. High doses of ionizing radiation essentially shred the DNA within your cells, preventing them from replicating.
So the cells in the human body that divide the fastest, like the lining of the gastrointestinal tract and the bone marrow, they die first.
Right. So survivors who appeared physically unharmed would suddenly experience catastrophic cellular failure.
They would lose all their hair in clumps.
Their immune systems would completely collapse. They would start bleeding from their guns.
And the black vomit that was frequently described, that was actually digested blood because the lining of their stomachs and intestines were luffing off.
They would simply waste away from the inside out.
And you might expect that in the face of this unprecedented, horrific suffering, there would be this huge outpouring of national grief and a massive relief.
What's fascinating here is that the exact opposite happened.
Yeah, and this is heavily detailed in Nakazawa's accounts and historical analyses, the intense societal discrimination leveled against the hibakusha.
The hibakusha. The literal translation is bomb-affected people.
Right. Instead of compassion, these survivors faced extreme prejudice and ostracization from their own countrymen. People outside of Hiroshima and Nagasaki simply did not understand radiation.
The government censored much of the information, too.
They did. And the general public basically viewed the hibakusha as contagious. They thought the radiation sickness was an infectious disease like leprosy or tuberculosis.
Survivors had to actively hide their status. They had to cover their burn scar and lie about where they were from just to secure basic employment or to get married.
Because people feared they would pass on mutated genes to their children.
It's a fascinating, deeply tragic sociological reaction to trauma. When confronted with an incomprehensible horror, society's instinct wasn't empathy, it was quarantine.
There is a specific, chilling anecdote from an interview with Nakazawa that highlights this perfect. He recounted that years later, if you traveled to Tokyo and the people there found out you were a hibakusha from Hiroshima, they wouldn't even touch a teacup that you had drunk from.
They were genuinely terrified of catching radioactivity from the ceramic.
Nakazawa noted that the apathy, the disgust, and the coldness in the eyes of his fellow citizens was sometimes more psychological than the physical burns.
And that complete societal rejection forced the survivors into incredibly tight, desperate community. They could only rely on each other because the outside world had shunned them.
This dynamic plays out vividly in the story as Gen tries to rebuild a semblance of his family. Gen and his mother, who are struggling to find food and shelter in the ruin, they end up adopting a street orphan.
And Ryuta is not just a random child. He is drawn to be practically a mirror image of Gen's deceased younger brother, Shin.
Yeah, he looks exactly like him, acts like him.
It's this desperate, profound psychological attempt by Gen and Kimi to resurrect the family they just watched burn to death.
And with a new baby to feed, and Kimi growing progressively weaker from her exposure to the black, Gen and little Ryuta basically become the primary bread.
They have to hustle, taking on incredibly grueling, heartbreaking jobs just to buy scraps of food.
There is one specific subplot that illustrates this post-war struggle perfectly. The boys are hired by a wealthy man, for a meager 10 yen a day to care for his brother, Seiji.
Right, Seiji. He was severely burned in the atomic blast and is suffering from acute radiation sickness.
His body is covered in festering necrotic wounds that are literally crawling with maggots.
And the most tragic element of Seiji's situation isn't even his physical condition, it's his isolation.
Yeah, Seiji's own family treats him like a repulsive monster. His sister-in-law expresses outright verbal disdain for his continued existence, just complaining about the smell and the burden.
His nieces watch him from a distance as if he's a freak in a sideshow. He is locked away in a dark shed, entirely isolated from human affection.
Because he has internalized this horrific prejudice from his own blood relatives, Seiji has become incredibly cynical, bitter, and verbally. He even throws things at Gen and Ryuta when they first arrive.
He represents the internal rot caused by societal discrimination. But Gen and Ryuta, who have seen the absolute worst the world has to offer, they refuse to be deterred by his anger.
Through their relentless, almost stubborn positivity, their absolute refusal to treat him like a monster, and their diligent daily care in physically cleaning the maggots from his wounds, they actually managed to pierce his hardened exterior.
They essentially cure his deep depression.
They really do. They even discover that he used to be an artist, and they rekindle his love for painting. They encourage him to use his mouth to hold the brush, since his hands are too ruined by burned scar tissue to hold it.
It's a powerful testament to human connect. By treating him with basic dignity, they remind him that he is still human.
And Seiji's brother is so moved by the miraculous change in Seiji's demeanor that he actually rewards the boys with 100.
Which, in the post-war economy, was a massive, life-changing sum of money.
Gen and Ryuta are absolutely ecstatic. They sprint straight to the black market. They buy highly coveted, incredibly expensive powdered milk for baby Tomoko, and they run all the way back to their makeshift shelter, cheering, singing, and celebrating.
And here's where the anime employs that brilliant cinematic technique of silence for a second. Absolutely devastating time.
Oh, this part is so hard to watch.
The boys burst into the shelter, holding up the tin of powdered milk like a trophy, victorious. And the triumphant music instantly cuts out.
There is pure, trackless audio silence.
The camera just holds on a long, static shot of Kimi, sitting in the shadows, rocking back and forth.
The boys keep cheering, completely oblivious to the atmosphere in the room, but the silence communicates everything to the audience before a single word is spoken.
When Kimi finally turns around, her face is hollow and tears are streaming down her. Baby Tomoko is dead.
She had already succumbed to malnutrition while they were out earning the money.
It is a crushing, suffocating blow. The boys did everything right. They worked incredibly hard. They showed deep compassion to a dying man. They earned the money honestly. They secured the milk.
And the brutal reality of their environment dictated that it still wasn't enough. It highlights the sheer, overwhelming, mathematically impossible odds stacked against survival in an irradiated.
The 1983 anime essentially concludes shortly after this heartbreak.
It does end on a surprisingly hopeful note, all things considered. Gen sees a patch of green wheat sprouting up through the irradiated gray ashes of the city, proving that the land isn't dead forever.
His hair, which had completely fallen out due to radiation exposure, begins to grow back in stubble.
Right, and he builds a little wooden boat to honor Shinji's spirit, places it in the river, and watches it float away into the sun. It's a cinematic resolution.
It provides necessary emotional closure for a film audience. But the historical reality is that the actual manga and the actual lives of the Hiroshima survivors kept going.
The struggle didn't neatly wrap up with the sunset boat ride. The remaining 8 volumes of the manga chart a long, arduous, deeply complex journey from late 1945 all the way to 1953.
Let's dive deep into that expanded lore, because I think it's crucial.
It transforms Barefoot Gen from simply being a bomb survival narrative into a massive, sprawling epic about the reconstruction of post-war Japan and the long tail of nuclear trauma.
Precisely. Volumes 2 through 10 expand the narrative scope significantly.
Yeah.
The immediate focus shifts to the slow, agonizing decline of Gen's mother, Kimi.
Because the initial blast didn't kill her, but the black rain did.
Right. She begins to slowly succumb to the long-term degenerative effects of radiation sickness. To keep her comfortable and to feed his adopted brother Ryuta, Gen is forced to navigate the treacherous black market economy of post-war Japan.
He takes on endless, grueling, odd jobs, from collecting scrap metal in the ruins to shining shoes for the American occupation.
But the world around them isn't static. It's actively shifting.
As Gen grows from a traumatized child into a teenager, he undergoes a profound political awakening. He begins to actively, vocally protest the emperor.
He starts questioning the systemic top-down decisions and the blind nationalism that led his family and his entire city to the slaughterhouse.
He and his friends even go so far as to help publish a book detailing the graphic atrocity.
They do this to fight back against the censorship implemented by the U.S. occupation force, who are actively trying to suppress photographs and accounts of the radiation.
And also to fight against the collective amnesia that was starting to take hold in Japanese society.
And as Gen is fighting this localized battle for memory and truth, the geopolitical wheels keep turning right back to war.
Yeah, by volume 8, Gen is in junior high school and the Korean War has broken out.
Japan suddenly becomes a massive staging ground and supply hub for the American military.
For Gen, seeing the fighter jets flying overhead again, seeing the machinery of war churning right next door, it serves as a grim, infuriating reminder that humanity hasn't learned a single lesson from Hiroshima. The war machine just relocated to a new peninsula.
The later volumes also refuse to shy away from the gritty, ugly reality of survival in a broken, reconstructing society. It's not all noble suffering.
One of Gen's close friends, Musubi, falls into the underbelly of the post-war slums. He develops a severe drug addiction and becomes indebted to the Yakuza, the Japanese organized crime syndicates that flourished in the black markets after the war.
And the Yakuza eventually murder Musubi,
which triggers a devastating chain reaction. Ryuta, who Gen adopted as a brother, refuses to let the murder go. He retaliates, violently killing several Yakuza members to avenge.
As a result, Ryuta is forced to flee Hiroshima entirely, heading to Tokyo as a wanted fugitive, fracturing their surrogate family once again.
It's incredibly bleak. And just when you think Gen might find some personal happiness, the atomic shadow reaches out and pulls him back. He experiences a beautiful, heartbreaking romance. He falls deeply in love with a girl named
But Mitsuko is a hibakusha.
And years after the bomb fell, she develops leukemia, cancer of the blood, which was one of the most common and fatal delayed casualties. Gen has to watch the woman he loves waste away and die from the same invisible poison that is her.
By the end of Volume 10, the manga reaches its conclusion around 1950. Gen graduates from junior high school, and he uses the graduation ceremony to stage a vocal, public protest against the war and the Emperor's complicity.
With his mother finally passing away from radiation sickness, his friends scattered, imprisoned, or dead, and his own heart broken by Mitsuko's death, Gen makes the definitive decision to leave the rebuilt, yet perpetually haunted city of...
He packs his few belongings and heads to Tokyo, determined to become a professional artist and fulfill his solemn promise to paint the unfiltered truth of what he witnessed.
It's a monumental, exhausting journey of a single human life. And to fully contextualize that journey, I want to loop back to the broader historical reality.
The aftermath of the bomb wasn't just polarizing and traumatic for the survivors on the ground in Japan. It was deeply polarizing for the very men who created the weapon.
Yes, the historical contrast between the political justification of the weapon and the human reality of deployment is starkly illustrated in the post-war dynamic between J. Robert Oppenheimer and President Harry.
We mentioned Oppenheimer managing the scientific hurdles of the Manhattan Project.
Right. But after the bombs were dropped and the classified reports and photographs of the total devastation, the melting skin, the radiation sickness, the sheer scale of civilian death started reaching his desk, Oppenheimer's initial feelings of scientific triumph completely evaporate.
He grasped the full, horrifying reality of the Pandora's box he had opened.
In October of 1945, he secured a meeting with President Truman in the Oval Office. Oppenheimer was distraught, and he famously told the president, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood."
And Truman's reaction to that statement, as documented in the historical records of the meeting, was one of absolute fear.
Truman viewed the dropping of the bomb not as a scientific experiment gone awry, but as a calculated, necessary executive.
Privately, he later referred to Oppenheimer as a crybaby scientist.
Truman felt that the burden of the decision, and therefore the moral weight, rested entirely on his own shoulders, as he reportedly told his aides that Oppenheimer didn't have half as much blood on his...
And he instructed them that he didn't want to see that, quote, son of a bitch in his office ever again.
Looking at it impartially, that Oval Office exchange perfectly encapsulates the vast, unbridgeable chasm between the political arithmetic of war and the crippling moral weight of action cost.
Truman was dealing with the geopolitics, weighing estimated troop casualties against strategic outcomes.
Oppenheimer was suddenly grappling with the flesh and blood consequences of his visit, and Keiji Nakazawa was the flesh and blood.
Which brings the narrative perfectly to the present day and how we interact with this history now. The city of Hiroshima today is a thriving, modern metropolis. It has rebuilt itself completely from the ashes.
But the scars remain, intentionally preserved so that the world does not forget.
If you visit modern-day Hiroshima, right in the center of the city is the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, commonly known as the Genbaku Dome.
It was originally the Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall. It was located practically directly beneath the hypocenter.
The bomb detonated almost directly above it, which is ironically why the vertical columns remained standing while the rest of the city was flattened by the outward shockwave.
Today, its skeletal, melted ruins have been preserved exactly as they looked after the fires died down. It sits there, a permanent, haunting World Heritage Site, modern office.
And nearby is the Shukeien Garden, a beautiful, tranquil space originally built in 1620 that was incinerated, but has been meticulously regrown and remains a place of quiet reflection.
But the most striking observation about modern Hiroshima occurs inside the Peace Memorial. The museum is a somber, darkly lit, incredibly heavy.
It is filled with the undeniable physical artifacts of the horror.
You walk down corridors, chunks of melted concrete, twisted steel helmets, charred bits of children's clothing, melted glass bottles,
and even actual human remains, shadows of people permanently flash burned. It is a place of absolute crushing gravity.
And yet, juxtaposed against these haunting relics, total annihilation, you will frequently see modern Japanese school children on field trip, and they are exactly like kids.
They're laughing with their friends, chattering about their day, playing games on their smartphones,
and excitedly running up to foreign tourists to practice saying hello in English. They walk past the melted tricycles and the photographs of the black rain, seemingly completely oblivious to the crushing gravity of the exhibits surrounding.
It creates a surreal, almost jarring duality. The absolute carnage of the past sitting right alongside the innocent, ignorant joy of the present.
So what does this all mean? We've traced a massive path today. From the secret geopolitical calculations of the Manhattan Project, through the blinding flash of August 6th, into the grueling, decade-long struggle of a boy trying to survive and find his humanity in radioactive ashes.
Barefoot Gen stands as a harrowing historical doc. It is a masterclass in the power of graphic storytelling to convey what textbooks cannot, and above all, it is a stark, screaming warning to the future.
It forces every single person who engages with it to confront the reality of cause and effect. For you listening, the takeaway from this deep dive is a reminder that understanding history cannot just be about memorizing the dates of treaties or the troop movements on a map. Real history is understanding the human cost,
the flesh and blood consequences of decisions made in quiet, comfortable rooms.
But simultaneous, Nakazawa's story is a testament to the incredible, almost incomprehensible resilience of the human spirit, the profound ability of a human being to be trampled into the dirt like winter wheat, frozen in a literal nuclear winter, and still somehow stubbornly take root, grow again, and yield something.
Which leaves us with a final lingering thought to consider, building on that scene in the modern museum. When we look at those children laughing and playing on their phones amidst the melted concrete and the horrific artifacts of nuclear hellfire, how should we feel?
That's a profound question.
Is their casual ignorance a tragedy of forgotten history, a failure to honor the dead? Or in a strange, bittersweet way, is it the ultimate victory of peace? Perhaps the greatest privilege of securing a peaceful future is granting the next generation the luxury of not having to understand the true horrors of the past.
That is a very profound thought to carry with you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you're given, keep seeking out the uncomfortable histories, and most importantly, keep learning.